Can I say something that might change forever? The way that you think about trauma? Trauma is not simply the worst thing that has ever happened to you. And trauma is not measured by how dramatic or even traumatic the event may have been, because it's not just the event. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of the event. And it's a way of stress changing your nervous system, your emotions, your beliefs, your body, your relationships, even your sense of safety, and sometimes even your sense of self. And I think it is important because so many people dismiss their own pain, dismiss the impacts of the events that happen in our lives, and saying, well, nothing that bad. We kind of um deify particular events as more traumatic than others, or other people had it worse, so I should be over this by now. But trauma is not a competition. It's not about who gets to be the most broken. Two people can go through the exact same event and walk away with completely different internal experiences from it. It's not just about the event that happened to you, it's about the experience that you walk away with as a result. Welcome back to the Girl Just Feel podcast, where faith meets mental health and healing starts with feeling your feelings. I'm your host, Dr. Ajane Gaylord, and today we're talking all about trauma. Now, I know, trauma conversation has literally taken over in the last, I would say, 10 or so years. We talk about it so much. We misuse it. We overuse the word trauma. Everything is trauma. Everything is triggering me. And not to minimize the fact that we do walk through very difficult experiences. I do not at all want to diminish the impact of tragic events, difficulties, challenges, and stress. And so we talked about in the last episode about stress, what it actually is, how we experience it, and kind of the things that we've gotten wrong about it. And so I want to deal with trauma in a similar sense. I can't unpack everything in this one episode, but I do want to begin with how we define it and how we can begin to view trauma from a lens. I think that would be more beneficial than detrimental. So, what is trauma actually? Well, what we get wrong about it is that it is the event that happened. For example, I experienced more than once a car accident or a car collision in my younger years. And that has really shaped how I view traveling in vehicles. I do have this, I don't want to call it anxiety around driving in cars, but I do have this hum underneath those experiences where I'm always surveying for danger. I'm always surveying for what doesn't feel safe to me. I'm always paying attention and often hyper vigilant about riding in cars and even my people coming home after a day. So I don't relax fully until all of my people come home for the evening. So my children, some of them are in college, are out and about. My husband, who may be out working, looking at houses, doing what he's doing, I don't really begin to rest fully until everybody's home and I know everyone's safe and nothing happened to them in a car. So a lot of my experiences around that are shaped by what I encountered and what the experience led to a change in my both biology and my psychology or beliefs or emotions or feelings about cars and traveling in cars. Now, I don't want to get too deep into all of the dialogue about the fact that when my mother was pregnant with me, she got into a car accident. I do believe that in utero, we experience our world as we're developing infants. As the fetus is developing, we have all types of experiences through what the mother consumes, through what you hear. And I do believe that that event shaped a lot of why, as I got older and then experienced subsequent car accidents, that led to my current perspective and beliefs about cars. Now, that doesn't keep me from riding in cars. It doesn't keep me from driving. It doesn't keep me from functioning in that capacity. But there's always that hum underneath reminding me of this potential threat or danger that could be present because of the experiences that I had in the past. Now, someone else could have had a very similar experience where they were in an accident or in a collision and they didn't change as a result of that event. They don't have that hum. They're not experiencing the surveying of constant threats or danger, danger, danger. And so then that would not have been traumatic for them because it did not change who they are or how they see the world. So, if I had to give you a definition of trauma, and there are tons of them out there are a lot of trauma experts and a lot of folks who claim to have uh, the knowledge in this category. But if I had to define it for you, I would define it in a couple of ways. And one would be that trauma is the biological and psychological response to overwhelming stress. The other way I would define it is that trauma is your body's and your beliefs' response to what has happened to you. So let's unpack those two. The first being the biological and psychological response to overwhelming stress. Now, when we defined stress before, and if you haven't listened to that episode, go back, take a listen, and see what I said about what stress actually is. If we go back to our understanding of stress, there's a demand. If we can meet that demand, then we just return back to our baseline. If there's a demand and we can't meet that demand, then that's where stress then comes into play. Now, if we have stress and we find a new resource to meet the demand, then we grow. But if we have stress and we're unable to address the needs or to meet the demand, that is what is considered a trauma, a response to the overwhelming stress we were unable to meet. And our second explanation is the response that our bodies and even what we believe, how it changes as a result. So again, trauma isn't the event. It's what changes in us as a result of the event. And just like with stress, if you're able to then address the overwhelming need and deal with the responses, that could potentially lead to another level of growth. So most of us understand what we call PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, or better stated, post-traumatic stress syndrome, meaning that there is a unrelenting, unresolved response to the trigger of a past stressor or trauma that has occurred that overwhelmed that person's capacity, overwhelmed their resources available, and it has not been resolved. But there's also a concept that we often don't pay attention to, which is called post-traumatic growth syndrome, meaning that there could be a traumatic event, there could be a moment in time where the response to overwhelming stress changed your beliefs in biology, but then you were able to find new resources, resolve it, process it, address it, deal with it, which led to a greater level of growth. There's that word again, growth. So why does any of this matter? Well, because we have spent so many years talking about trauma, saying everything is a trauma. And it's almost like people's approach to it is as if there's nothing they can do about the trauma. That it's fixed, it's the event occurred, it's happened, and there's nothing they can do. Well, not everything can be fixed, but some things can be felt. And that, I think, is the missing piece in a lot of cases where things that have occurred that have led to a change in somebody's biology, how their body responds, their nervous system, even their cells. A lot of autoimmune diseases can be traced back to early traumas. But there's also this idea that you can't overcome it, or that it's always going to be a badge that you have to wear or a scarlet letter that you have to wear. And I want to suggest to you that there's an opportunity here to face and confront and deal with the events and the result of those events in your life without fear and without being so consumed that you feel like it'll never change. I want to give you hope that there is possibility of change. If it changed you the first time, it can change again. It's not fixed. It can be healed. It can be improved. Now, there are situations that feel impossible to us, that seem unchangeable, that seem like it'll never get better. But my hope is that we can begin to just take a moment of bravery and face things and address what we're feeling, sensing, experiencing, relating to. Trauma is often about adaptation, how you adapt to the situation, the circumstances, the event. One of the most important things to understand about trauma is this: it trauma changes people, not because they're weak, but because human beings adapt to survive. And many of the things that we criticize about ourselves today may have originally been survival adaptation. So, like our hyper independence, our people pleasing, our emotional numbness, our overworking, difficulty trusting. So, let me just tell on myself for a minute. In response to circumstances in my childhood that were out of my control, that I felt like there was nothing I can do about. And it did change my biology, I believe, or, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and even relationally. The story that I tell myself about those things and the experiences I was having, and a lot of what that did was it led me to become someone who operated from hyper independence, meaning I was going to figure it out on my own. I was going to make it happen. I was going to do what I needed to do and to become a high achiever. I remember being in, like, I think it was like eighth grade, that my eighth grade teacher, he was actually happened to be a male teacher, said something at a parent teacher conference my mother had come to. I had, been a decent student, decent grades. I did go to school a little early. They wanted to promote me in elementary school, I think between fourth and fifth grade or something like that. My mother said no. But what ended up happening was I was young. I was a year younger than most of my classmates already, and by the time I got to eighth grade, I was just, doing the basics, kind of showing up because I had so much emotional turmoil happening within me because of home circumstances, that school was like my escape. It was a place that I felt affirmed and acknowledged. And so I would perform academically and even, musically. I was in the choirs and things like that in school. And my teacher basically, because I was probably a B student at the time, and what he said was, she could be a straight A student if she just tried. And that triggered me, quote unquote. And I thought I was trying, or at least I was giving it enough to receive the accolades or the validation that I was looking for. And I believe it was subconscious. It's not like I was intentionally like mapping out how can I be validated, but in my little 11-year-old, 12-year-old brain. But what that did was it awakened something in me. And I decided from that moment forward that I was going to be a straight A student. And I was. I got straight A's all through the rest of my um, eighth grade year into my ninth grade, went on to high school and was valedictorian of my graduating class. Not because I was the smartest, not because I was the most intelligent, but because it was a challenge that I was given, and it was in a response to what I felt like was so out of control in other areas of my life. It was an overcorrection for something that I felt had changed how I saw myself. And my overperforming, high achieving tendencies had a lot to do with my personality. It wasn't that it was so far fetched from who I am, but I think it was a trauma response. And sometimes, not all the time, what we see as success, what we see as high achieving, high capacity, high functioning is actually not success, not high achievement, but it's actually a trauma response, because it's a way for us to respond to that overwhelming stress that has changed our biology, that has changed us psychologically, that has adjusted our belief system and the story that we tell ourselves, is that we decide to overcorrect what we feel is that deficit. And it ends up looking like high achievement, high function, hyper independence. I don't need anyone. I can do all the things I can do, and I can wear the superwoman cape. Now, in my research, I research about Black maternal mental health, and I look specifically at how stigmas and stereotypes impact Black maternal and infant health outcomes. And one of the stereotypes that we hear so much about is the strong Black woman. This is a trope that has circulated for, generations. And the idea is that you're so strong and capable and you can do it yourself and you don't need anybody's help and you can handle it, you can take it on. And it's like you wear a big S on your chest, you put on the cape, you get it all done, you accomplish it. But really, it is an overgeneralization of some modeling of strength among Black women for sure, but it comes with a burden. It comes with an emotional burden, a physical burden. Black women tend to be those who experience the highest rates and disparities in medical and mental health outcomes. It isn't just the allure of superiority or superhuman strength, but it's the false sense and the false notion that we can take on anything and we can override our own needs. That is not true. When the demand or the need isn't met, that's where we find stress. And when there is stress that also leads to a lack of new resources being developed, that is where the trauma shows. So this can show up in quote unquote what we view as compelling or positive, ways of hyper independence, hyper vigilance, being able to be super achieving, and even leads to perfectionism. But it can also lead to things that seem more suppressed, like people pleasing, agreeing to things that you really don't want to agree to, letting people get away with things that really you should be holding them accountable to, emotional numbness, difficulty trusting, shutting down. That's a huge one that we often don't pay attention to. Even avoiding conflict and feeling unsafe, even when it's time to rest. Rest doesn't even feel safe because the narrative, the story, what we've been saying about productivity, what we've been saying about producing or making things happen or being a girl boss or whatever you want to call it, is how we then determine whether or not we're managing, which is untrue. A lot of times people think this is just my personality. This is just how I am. But sometimes it's actually your nervous system has adapted to overwhelming experiences. And today is not the day to get into the nervous system conversation. We just like we have done with trauma, we have overused that term and we have misunderstood a lot about how our nervous system works and what it's supposed to do and what it isn't supposed to do and all the things. And so we've kind of come up with this terminology, these phrases, these catchphrases. We're listening to people online who have no credentials and no training and no experience, and using that as our way of filling up our emotional and mental health arsenal of knowledge, when I think it's more important to really fully understand what we're talking about, to not just take somebody's word for it, but to really dig into these things ourselves and make sure we can fully understand what is being said. So often what looks like strength is really not strength at all. People are not living from a place of peace and success. They're actually living from a place of adaptation. So you adapt to survive. And all of those adaptations are not always good for us. Some are good. Again, those things lead to growth. We're able to pull new resources, find new levels of support, and then we're able to grow from that. But a lot of times, some of those things become pathological, meaning they become behaviors, beliefs, and even our biology that ends up leading to dis-ease and disconnection and dissociation, to where we are now compartmentalizing ourselves and disconnecting from our very being in order to just survive. We don't want to feel because we're afraid that the feelings will override us, so to speak, and then we'll be unable to cope, when really it's because we adapted incorrectly. So we often reduce trauma to the traumatic event instead of understanding the internal overwhelm. And I think it's time for us to begin to unpack and to face and to resolve and to express the feelings that we experience, because that is who we are as human beings. We are spirit, soul, body. We are made in the image of God. We reflect who He is. And He has revealed to us throughout Scripture how to express emotion, the bodily responses, to the external stimuli. The the scriptures are full of ways that people emoted and they expressed and they revealed what was going on emotionally and even physically in their bodies in response to grief and loss and pain and challenge and threats and war and all of these things. And I think it's important for us to begin to acknowledge that trauma isn't the event. Trauma is how you have been changed by the event. And if that change eventually leads to new resources and growth, that then becomes post traumatic growth. But if it leads to symptoms and syndromes and situations that are not good for us, then it becomes detrimental. So my hope is that as we begin to unpack in more episodes to come, the things that we've been discussing and learn how to face what we're feeling without judgment, without fear, and we begin to learn new strategies and techniques, I think it will help us to recognize that, number one, most of what we're calling trauma is not. And if we have experienced a trauma, it's not the end. It doesn't mean that it's over. It means that something new is about to begin, or at least there's an opportunity. And so I invite you to begin to view what real traumas have happened in your life. And sometimes that means you will need support and help and assistance with processing through that. This isn't necessarily something that you can do all on your own. So that's where licensed, well trained, professional mental health practitioners are very beneficial. This is where counseling and therapy in particular, and I have an older episode about the differences between therapy and counseling. They are not the same thing. That therapy can be very helpful with unpacking, coming up with a treatment plan, dealing with strategies and patterns, and reversing some of these patterns. Can be very beneficial. Of course, as a believer, prayer is always in order. I think that prayer and faith is very beneficial to that process. Understanding God's word, understanding how He created us, understanding who He made us to be and how He desires for us to connect with Him helps us to then deal with the tragedies and traumas and difficulties of life. We understand because He's given us a roadmap through the scriptures to help us to unpack how we then respond to these events in our lives and how we respond to these experiences and how we then decide what script we're going to live from. Because the story that we should tell ourselves should be rooted in His truth and not in our tragedy. So I want us to trust that we are capable of more than I think we give ourselves credit for. But I don't want us to be so overly confident that we don't seek help where we need it. So this is my life work for you this week. I want you to identify if there is something traumatic that actually did happen in your life that you have yet to resolve. I want to admonish you to seek professional help. Seek out qualified, trained mental health practitioners who can assist you in addressing, healing, and dealing with that traumatic event, because there is a possibility of healing. There is a possibility of growth. There is a possibility that you can overcome what felt so overwhelming. And you can indeed heal from your past. You don't have to be a captive of your past. You can find ways to cope and to grow from the things that you have encountered. How do I know? Because I've been able to do it. I'm still doing it. So I hope you can join me in the journey. See you next time.